A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. Imagine a single person who has the power to write every law you live by, the authority to send the police to your front door to enforce them, and the final word in a courtroom on whether you actually broke them. No appeals, no oversight, no second opinions. Now, that sounds like the setup for a dystopian novel or a particularly grim prestige TV show, but for the vast majority of human history, that wasn't fiction. It was just Tuesday. It was the standard operating procedure for almost every civilization on Earth, until about 300 years ago.
It's a terrifying thought when you really sit with it. The concentration of power is essentially the gravity of politics. It wants to pull everything into a single, dense point. And breaking that gravity, creating a system where power is intentionally fractured and set against itself, is arguably the greatest technology humanity has ever invented. It's certainly more important than the steam engine or the internet when it comes to how we actually live together without killing each other. Think about the sheer psychological shift required to tell a ruler. You can't do that because a piece of paper says so. It's counterintuitive to everything we know about how physical force works.
Well, our friend Daniel wants us to dive into exactly that today. He sent us a prompt saying, let's discuss the concept of the separation of powers, how it came to be, and how it has been applied differently across societies. And I think this is a perfect time to dig into the guts of the machine, especially as we see institutional norms being tested all over the globe. By the way, Herman, I should mention today's episode is actually being powered by Google Gemini 3 Flash. It's writing the script for us, though I like to think it's capturing my natural charm.
I'll believe that when the AI starts making obscure references to 1800s Prussian military doctrine, Corn. But back to Daniel's prompt, this is a massive topic. When we talk about the separation of powers, we're usually talking about the tripartite model, the legislative, which makes the laws, the executive, which carries them out, and the judicial, which interprets them. But the real magic isn't just that they are separate, it's how they are designed to be at each other's throats.
Right, it's not a peaceful coexistence, it's a choreographed wrestling match. But before we get into the modern brawling, we have to talk about where this started. Because people didn't just wake up in 1748 and decide kings were a bad idea. This goes way back to the ancients, doesn't it?
It does, though they didn't quite have the separation part down yet. They had what they called the mixed regime. If you look at Aristotle's Politics, written around 350 BCE, he identified three elements in every constitution: the deliberative, the magisterial, and the judicial. But Aristotle wasn't arguing that these should be independent branches in the way we think of them. He was more concerned with social balance. He wanted a government that combined elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy so that no one social class, the rich, the poor, or the one strong leader, could totally dominate the others.
So it was less about functional roles and more about making sure the peasants and the lords didn't start a civil war every 20 years.
Well, no, I shouldn't say exactly. It was about stability. The Roman Republic took this even further. They had the consuls, who were the executive power, the Senate, which represented the aristocracy, and the assemblies, which represented the people. And they had this fascinating role called the tribune of the plebs. The tribunes had the power of veto, literally Latin for I forbid. They could stand in the middle of a meeting and stop a law from passing. That's a direct ancestor of the checks and balances we see today.
But how did that actually work in the streets? I mean, if a consul wanted to go to war and a tribune said, I forbid, didn't the consul just push him out of the way?
In theory, the tribune's person was sacrosanct. If you touched a tribune, you were technically cursed and could be killed without trial. It was a religious and legal shield. It worked until it didn't, usually when the political stakes got so high that people stopped caring about the curses. But for centuries, that veto was the only thing standing between the common people and total exploitation by the elite.
It's funny how the veto has survived for 2,000 years. But the ancient version of this always seems to end with a Caesar or a Sulla just walking in with an army and saying, "Cool system, but I have all the swords, so I'm the legislative, executive, and judicial branch now." The real theoretical breakthrough, the one that actually stuck in a way that produced modern democracy, didn't happen until the Enlightenment.
Right, and the name everyone needs to know here is Montesquieu. Baron de Montesquieu published The Spirit of the Laws in 1748. He spent 27 years writing this thing. Can you imagine the draft folders on his desk? And his big observation came from looking at the English system of the time. Now, irony alert, Montesquieu actually kind of misinterpreted how the British government worked. He saw a much cleaner separation between the king and parliament than actually existed, but his misunderstanding became the most influential political theory in history.
It's the ultimate fake it till you make it. He described an idealized version of England, and the world said, "Actually, that sounds way better than the real England. Let's build that."
His core argument was simple but profound. There can be no liberty where the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person. He argued that if the person who makes the laws also enforces them, they will inevitably make tyrannical laws so they can enforce them in a tyrannical way. And if you add the judge into that mix, the life and liberty of the citizen are at the mercy of arbitrary control.
Think about that in a modern context. If the person who gets to decide that speeding is a felony is the same person who pulls you over and the same person who decides if you're guilty, you're never winning that case. You're just a character in a rigged game.
Precisely. Montesquieu's genius was realizing that virtue isn't enough. You can't just hope for a good king, you have to assume the worst of people in power. He famously said, "Every man invested with power is apt to abuse it, and to carry his authority as far as it will go. So, the only way to stop power is with more power."
And this is where the Americans enter the chat. Because while Montesquieu provided the philosophy, guys like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton had to figure out the actual architecture. They were basically the software engineers who had to write the code for a system that wouldn't crash the first time someone got greedy for power.
And Madison was a realist borderline cynic about human nature. In Federalist Number 51, which is probably the most famous piece of political writing in American history, he wrote, "Ambition must be made to counteract ambition." He knew you couldn't rely on enlightened statesmen to always be in charge. You had to assume the people in power would be ambitious and potentially corrupt. So you give the president the veto to check Congress, you give Congress the power of the purse and impeachment to check the president, and you give the courts the power to strike down laws that violate the Constitution.
It's like a game of rock, paper, scissors, but everyone has a lawsuit or a budget cut instead of a hand gesture. But here's what I find interesting, Ehrman. We often think of these branches as being totally separate, like they live in different houses and never talk. But the US system is actually designed for overlapping jurisdiction. The president is the executive, but he has a say in legislation through the veto. The Senate is legislative, but they have a say in the executive through advice and consent on appointments. Why did they make it so messy?
Because if they were truly separate, they could each become a little tyrant in their own silo. If the executive had zero interaction with the legislature, the president could just ignore the laws. By forcing them to interact, by making them check each other, you force them to negotiate. It's tension by design. The goal isn't efficiency. In fact, the separation of powers is the enemy of efficiency. It's designed to be slow, frustrating, and difficult.
I love that phrase, the enemy of efficiency. In our world, efficiency is usually seen as the ultimate good. We want our apps to load fast, our deliveries to arrive same day. But in government, efficiency is often just another word for dictatorship. If one person can decide everything instantly, that's efficient, but it's also terrifying.
Fast. Government is a government that can take away your rights before you even realize what's happening. The friction is the point. It's like the brakes on a car. You don't want the brakes to be efficiently absent so you can go faster. You want them to be extremely effective at stopping you from flying off a cliff.
Which is a hard sell in the 21st century when we want everything to happen at the speed of a fiber optic connection. But let's look at how other people do it, because the American model isn't the only way to skin this cat. Daniel mentioned the parliamentary system in his notes, and that's actually much more common worldwide.
It is. In a parliamentary system like the United Kingdom, Canada, or Israel, you have a fusion of powers rather than a strict separation. The executive, the prime minister, and the cabinet are actually members of the legislature. They sit in the building, they vote on laws, and they lead the majority party.
Wait, so Montesquieu would be rolling in his grave, right? He said you can't have the executive and legislative powers in the same hands.
On the surface, yes, but in a parliamentary system, the check is different. The executive is only in power as long as they have the confidence of the parliament. If they lose a major vote, the government falls and you have new elections. It's a more direct line of accountability. The separation there is really between the political government and the permanent state, the civil service and the judiciary. In the UK, for example, the judges are incredibly independent, and there's a ceremonial head of state, like the king, who represents the state, while the prime minister represents the government.
So in the US, the president is both the head of state and the head of government. In the UK, they split those roles. Does that actually help with the separation of powers?
It can. It provides a neutral figure who isn't involved in the day-to-day political bickering. When a prime minister is forced to resign, the king or queen provides the continuity. It prevents the kind of regime change, panic you sometimes see in presidential systems, but it relies heavily on unwritten rules, on conventions. And as we've seen lately, conventions are a lot easier to break than written laws.
It's a different flavor of the same goal. But then you have the hybrid models, like France. They have a semi-presidential system where you have a popularly elected president who handles big picture stuff like foreign policy and defense, but also a prime minister who handles the day-to-day administration and has to answer to the parliament. It's like having two CEOs who are constantly looking over each other's shoulders.
And that can lead to cohabitation, where the president is from one party and the prime minister is from another. Talk about a recipe for awkward office holiday parties. Imagine trying to run a country when the person in charge of the army and the person in charge of the budget literally can't stand each other's platforms. It forces a very specific kind of compromise, or it leads to total paralysis.
But what about outside the Western tradition? Daniel pointed out something I didn't know much about, the censorate in ancient China.
This was wild. For over 2,000 years, starting way back in the Qin and Han dynasties, China had this fourth branch, called the censorate. Their whole job was to investigate corruption and, get this, actually criticize the emperor. That takes some serious guts. Hey, Mr. Absolute Ruler, I've noticed your latest decree is a bit tyrannical. Mind if I file a report?
Right? But it shows that even in an autocracy, there was a recognized need for an internal check. It wasn't separation of powers in the democratic sense, because the emperor still held the ultimate power, but it was an institutionalized form of oversight. It was the eyes and ears of the state. They could literally impeach officials, and while they couldn't fire the emperor, their public criticism carried a massive amount of moral weight. It was a check on legitimacy.
It reminds me of the Iroquois Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee. Their great law of peace is one of the most sophisticated constitutional frameworks in history, and it predates the U.S. Constitution by centuries. They had a bicameral system where the older brothers and younger brothers debated laws separately, but they also had a third group, the Onondaga, who acted as firekeepers. They held the tie-breaking or veto power.
And the coolest part of that system was the role of the clan mothers. They were the ones who nominated the chiefs and, more importantly, had the power to remove them. It was a check on power based on gender and social role rather than just political office. It's a much more holistic way of thinking about balance than just who gets to sign the bill.
It really challenges the idea that this is just a Western Enlightenment era invention. The need for balance is universal because the risk of concentrated power is universal. Even in Islamic history, you see this with the dual legal system. You had the Sharia, which was interpreted by independent scholars, the ulama, and then you had the Sultan's administrative law or Qanun. Because the Sultan didn't create the religious law, he was technically subject to it. The judges, the qadis, had a level of autonomy because their authority came from the law itself, not just the sultan's whim.
So, historically, how does a system like that actually handle a conflict? If the Sultan says, I want to seize this land, and the Qadi says, the law forbids it, what happened?
It was a constant tug of war. The sultan could fire a judge, but if he did it too often or without cause, he'd face a massive backlash from the religious establishment and the public. The power of the judge was the power of public opinion and divine law. It's a reminder that the separation of powers isn't just about what's written in a constitution, it's about what the people are willing to tolerate.
It's the normative power. But let's bring this into the modern day, Herman, because we're seeing some really creative and, frankly, scary ways that the separation of powers is being dismantled. It's what some political scientists call constitutional capture.
This is where things get really technical and really dangerous. In places like Poland over the last decade, or Hungary, you don't see a dictator just abolishing the courts. That would be too obvious. Instead, they use the legal process to pack the courts with loyalists. They change the retirement age. They create new disciplinary chambers for judges, and they slowly turn the independent judiciary into an arm of the executive.
It's like the software is still running, but the code has been hacked from the inside. The screen says democracy, but the background processes are all doing something else.
Precisely. And in the US, we see a different kind of pressure. We have the administrative state, all these independent agencies like the Federal Reserve or the SEC. Some people argue they become a fourth branch that lacks accountability because they write rules, that function like laws, enforce them, and have their own administrative judges. It's like the three branches all decided to outsource their work to a giant bureaucracy that nobody actually voted for.
But how does that happen in practice? Does Congress just give up?
In many ways, yes. Writing detailed laws on, say, carbon emissions or high-frequency trading is hard and politically risky. So Congress passes a broad law saying, make the air clean, and then they hand the actual power to an agency. That agency then becomes the legislator, the enforcer, and the judge for that specific area. It's a micro-concentration of power that bypasses the Madisonian architecture.
Well, and then there's the executive order phenomenon. When Congress is in permanent gridlock and can't pass a law to save its life, the president starts ruling by decree. And then the Supreme Court has to step in and decide if that's okay, which makes the court look political. It's like the whole system is being squeezed because the legislative branch, the one that's supposed to be the most powerful, has basically stopped working.
It's a dysfunction loop. If one branch abdicates its power, the others will naturally expand to fill the vacuum. Power, like nature, abhors a vacuum. If Congress won't legislate, the president will regulate and the courts will adjudicate the fallout. The problem is that the legislature is the only branch directly accountable to the people in a granular way. When they step back, the whole system loses its democratic anchor.
So, for the person listening to this who isn't a constitutional scholar, what does this actually mean for them? How do you even tell if the separation of powers is healthy, or if it's on life support?
You have to look at the friction. A healthy democracy should be noisy and full of conflict between the branches. If the president and the legislature are in total agreement all the time, or if the courts never strike down a government action, that's actually a warning sign. You want to see the veto being used. You want to see oversight hearings that are actually uncomfortable for the people in power.
So, gridlock is actually a feature, not a bug.
To a point, yes. It's the safety on the gun. It's there to make sure you don't fire it by accident. One practical thing listeners can do is track specific metrics. Look at the ratio of executive orders to actual legislation passed. Look at how judicial appointments are handled. Are they being confirmed with broad support? Or is it a narrow, partisan knife fight? And pay attention to the independent agencies. Are they being protected from political interference, or are they being purged every time a new party takes office?
It's about institutional health, not just who's winning the news cycle today. I think that's a really important distinction. You can like the outcome of a government action, but if the process that produced it broke the separation of powers, you've just traded a short-term win for a long-term structural weakness.
That's a great way to put it. It's like using a sledgehammer to fix a leaky faucet. You might stop the leak, but you've compromised the structural integrity of the whole house. In a few years, when someone you don't like is holding that sledgehammer, you're going to regret making it the standard tool for home repair.
It's the difference between rule by law and the rule of law. Rule by law is when the government uses the law as a tool to control the people. The rule of law is when the law controls the government. Separation of powers is the only thing that keeps us in the second category.
And it's fragile. It's not a self-executing system. It requires what the founders called civic virtue. It requires people in office to care more about the institution than their own party's immediate victory. If a senator is willing to let a president of their own party overreach just to get a policy win, the separation of powers is already dying.
And that leads us to the big what if for the future. We're moving into a world of AI-driven governance and algorithmic decision-making. We already have algorithms deciding who gets a loan or who gets bail. What happens to the separation of powers when the executive is an automated system and the legislative is just feeding it data?
That is the million-dollar question. Our current system is designed for humans. It's designed to counteract human ambition. But how do you check an algorithm? How do you impeach a black box model? We might need to invent a fifth branch, a technological oversight body that has the Sora code, level access to ensure the digital state isn't bypassing the constitutional one.
A digital censorate. I like it. We're coming full circle back to the Han Dynasty. But seriously, how would a court even handle a case where the law was interpreted by a neural network that no human can actually explain?
We're already seeing the beginning of this with algorithmic transparency, laws, but the separation of powers will have to evolve. We might see the rise of auditor branches that don't make laws or enforce them, but simply have the power to see into the black box. If the data is the new power, then the separation of powers must include the separation of data.
History doesn't repeat, but it definitely rhymes. The tools change, but the problem of power is eternal. Whether it's a king with a crown, a president with a pen, or an AI with a prompt, if you give them all the power, they will eventually use it against you.
It's a constant vigil. As soon as you think the system is fixed, that's exactly when the rot starts to set in. You have to keep the tension alive. You have to keep the wrestling match going.
Well, on that cheery note, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. From Aristotle's mixed regime, to the Iroquois clan mothers, to the modern brawls in our courtrooms. It's a lot to process, but it's probably the most important operating system we have.
It really is. And it's an operating system that requires constant patches and updates from the citizens. It's not a set it and forget it deal. If you aren't paying attention to the plumbing of your democracy, don't be surprised when the basement floods.
Thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes. And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show, including the Gemini 3 Flash model that helped us out today. If you want to dive deeper into these topics, you can find our full archive and RSS feeds at myweirdprompts.com.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you found this useful, please leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. It really does help us reach more people who care about these deep dives. We've got some great episodes coming up on the history of central banking and the evolution of maritime law, so stay tuned.
Until next time, keep an eye on those branches. You don't want any of them getting too big.
Goodbye, everyone.
See ya. This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash, text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My